Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Jeff Moon served as an assistant U.S. trade representative in the Obama administration. He's currently an international trade consultant. Saruhan Hatipoglu is the CEO of Business Environment Risk Intelligence and CGTN's Global Economics Analyst. Joining us from Portland, Oregon is Liang. She is an associate professor and the head of Willamette University's Department of Economics. And Gong is a professor at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Gong, let's start right there in Beijing. As we heard from our reporter there's been nothing official, no official announcement. But the information that we are getting is that most of the major issues have been resolved. 90% we're hearing has been resolved. And the focus now is on implementing that deal. What's the view from Beijing? Do you think we have a fully comprehensive deal in the works here?
I think I fully agree with Nathan that we are very close. We're not just seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, probably we're very close to the end of the tunnel. I think the very few issues, just based on what I've watched so far, there are probably very few issues still left, mostly regarding the enforcement mechanism. I think also there's some maybe some dispute about when and where the two presidents will meet, and I think that's about that. I mean, it's certainly very great to hear the news that from what we heard from President Trump in this meeting with Mr. Liu He. So it's a very upbeat statement so far. So I'm very optimistic. I think from Beijing's side, the government must be pretty happy right now.
Jeff Moon, very upbeat, true, but we keep hearing about implementation enforcement. What are the nuts and bolts of that? You've been a negotiator. What does that mean when they say they still have to resolve that?
Well, implementation is one of the most important issues that there is. You have to have a mechanism in order to process issues as they come up. You have to have very clear benchmarks that you're trying to hit, and then there need to be consequences. Now, for 30 years before President Trump came into office, there was an annual Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade that handled trade issues. And it was very similar in process to what has been described by Mr. Lighthizer. We know how to set up the mechanism and how to manage that. It's been done before. The benchmarks are going to be a little harder to establish. It'll be easy to establish benchmarks with respect to, say, purchases. Those are very concrete. But with progress on laws and different policies, that may be harder to measure. And then in terms of consequences, this is where we get into tariffs. Yeah. Frankly, the JCCT process was not successful because there were no consequences when promises were not delivered. And this is why tariffs, whether they get removed and with the possibility of coming back or stay in place, there need to be consequences for non-performance because this is a demonstrated problem that we have from historical precedent.
Liang, Jeff Moon, they're talking about consequences if parts of this agreement are not implemented by one or other side. We understand that the United States wants to keep some tariffs in place for a, quote, substantial period of time. That's what President Trump is saying, substantial period of time. Is China likely to accept that?
I don't think so. I think, one of the conditions for China to, make major recessions in some of the very critical areas is to resume the normal, trade relations. So I think having, tariffs, we're back to, the beginning. If there's no clear timeline when these tariffs will be phased out. And I also think that, it is not to the advantage to the American businesses or consumers to keep paying for these tariffs. After all, these tariffs are paid by the U.S. consumers and businesses, which added to billions of dollars of extra business operations. So I think, China has made many concessions in many important fronts, and I think it's important for the United States to, keep its promise to phase out the tariffs, if not, lifted them all at once.
Saruhan, the president says he likes tariffs. He said that in the White House today. But the IMF says a 25% U.S. tariff on about $540 billion worth of Chinese goods would hurt U.S. GDP and global growth. This is what the IMF managing director, Christine Lagarde, said.
We have looked at what might happen if tariffs on all goods traded between the US and China went up by 25 percentage points. That alone, so 25% tariff increase on all goods traded between the US and China. That would entail a reduction of GDP of 0.6% for the United States and 1.5% for China. Do the math.
So if these tariffs are kept, will the United States be hurting itself?
Of course, there's a part of shooting yourself in the foot here. But at the same time, what we have seen over the past 6 months or so is concrete progress as to where we're going with the tariff negotiations. And when we were talking about it 6 months ago, and you asked me, I said I wasn't too optimistic about it. But we are actually very close to the end of this. Now, the point becomes, and yes, President Trump says he likes tariffs, but he has to say this at this point because tariffs are in place. He cannot say, oh, I'm going to lift it as soon as a trade agreement is signed, because they're going to watch for verification as to what's happening with the forced technology transfers. There's a patent law right now in China, for example, about intellectual property. They're going to watch this. And I don't believe, given what the economic indicators are right now, we have a stock market that's doing really well. But if you look at the macro data, the U.S. is actually slowing down. Personal consumption is slowing down. Personal income is slowing down. Real GDP has been revised in the fourth quarter. And corporate earnings are going to be pretty bad first quarter. Almost every company came and said, we're not going to be able to meet what we promised last year. President Trump is hearing these statements and watching this data as well.
Gong, the U.S. goal was to get China to open its markets, to relax foreign investment restrictions, to impose these controls on intellectual property, etc. Has the U.S. largely got what it wanted?
I think we have here in China passed a law, as you know, and although this law is at a fairly high level, there are going to be administrative guidelines coming from various relevant government ministries, and I think more importantly is that the channel of communication between corporate America operating in China and the government is wide open. There's a way for these businesses to express their opinions with the Chinese governments, and I think the Chinese governments take their views very seriously. And so all these venues are all open there, and the next round of those very concrete, there could be a lot of these very concrete administrative guidelines or interpretations of the law will be introduced in the next few weeks and few months. So in that sense, I think the issues, at least from the perspective of market access and technology transfers, as a matter of fact, there's a specific clause in that law saying that forced transfer technology is absolutely prohibited. So all these things are going to be addressed, in my opinion. And that I want to add a note about the idea that the U.S. government wants to keep some tariffs in place for the initial $50 billion of Chinese exports to the United States. In my opinion, is that what's the point of doing this? Because they can slap back tariffs anytime they want, right? So there's a small probability, in my opinion, that things will go not right. These tariffs will be snapped back, but keeping the $50 billion tariff there, it's not going to make much of a difference. It's not going to raise a lot of revenues for the United States, and it's not going to differ very much in its enforcement power from slapping these tariffs back again if this thing doesn't go right.
Is that a fair point, Jeff? You don't need to formally write that into any kind of agreement. The U.S. can simply say you're not complying with the agreement, the tariffs come back.
Right, I agree. I agree that the tariffs should be removed. I think the American business community thinks that the tariffs should be removed. I think many of the people in administration agree the tariffs should be removed. There's one person that disagrees. He happens to be the president. So with respect to whether we've dealt with all of the issues, we hear lots of positive statements from both sides. 90% of the issues have been solved, but the process is not transparent. We really don't know very much other than leaks and a few comments from the president. The areas of progress that have been identified are extremely modest. We were just talking about the foreign investment law, which I think the foreign community believes is worded very vaguely. It needs to be fleshed out, and it has an enormous national security exception that will swallow the rule. We have a concession with regard to cloud computing, where American companies may be allowed to set up pilot projects in a single remote province in Western China. This is technology that dates back to the 1960s, was invented in the United States, and Alibaba sells here in the US. In this financial services area, China has the largest 4 banks in the world. And yet we are talking about the ability of single firms to come in and operate in the Chinese market, or for American credit card issuers to even be able to operate. So my point here is that we hear very general positive statements, but there are no concrete examples of enormous advancement. And then when President Trump talks about, in the clip, about how tariffs, enforcement, those are the biggest issues. So so I wonder, are we going to get a trade deal that really addresses the issues, or are we going to get a political deal that is just a temporary ceasefire, and as soon as the ink is dry, we go back to the conflict we've had for many years?
That's a great point, but I also have to mention, I think this is the very reason that the tariffs need to be in place at this point. And I'm saying this as a free trader. I can't believe I'm saying this. Look, the impact on a business, if you're saying, I'm going to apply these tariffs, I'm going to take them back, and hey, if I don't see what I like, I may put them back together, creates a lot of uncertainty. The tariffs are in place. I did not agree with that in the beginning, especially to the level that it was, but they're in place. Right now, you can sit down at the table and say, hey, here are specific triggers that we can agree on, and if there's enforcement here, we're going to reduce the tariffs at a steady basis. I think for businesses that are looking for certainty, that might just be the way to go.
Yan Liang, the White House economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, he said that China has acknowledged during the talks that the U.S. has legitimate concerns over forced intellectual property transfers and cyber hacking. First, do we know if this is true, and what impact is that going to have on the negotiations, on the final agreement?
Well, I think, for the interest of China, it is, good for them to enforce intellectual property rights going forward if they do want to foster, domestic, homegrown innovations. So I think, from my point of view is, the U.S. has a point about protecting intellectual property rights, and China has been working towards this. And I wanted to comment back on, Jeff's point. I think, yes, China is making progress. Maybe the progress is slow in terms of opening up the markets, but primarily Ke Qiang has talked about, shrinking the size of the so-called negative list, where foreign entry is prohibited or limited, and he will announce a new list in June. And I'm pretty optimistic about, having more foreign, entries, more access of foreign businesses to China. Especially, in sectors like financial sector, cloud computing, digital trade. I think there are security issues, but China has been making great efforts to opening up for market entry, and this is one of the binding sort of agreement that by 2025 China would allow for 100% foreign-owned, U.S. companies to operate in China in certain, sectors, and then ever-expanding sectors. And in terms of intellectual property rights, I think it's also showing that China is making earnest efforts. So this new foreign investment law, even though some people believe this is too vague, but this is a new law that replaced the law that has been in China for the past 20, 30 years. So it is an improvement. And not to mention, in practice, China has prosecuted a lot more people for violation of intellectual property rights last year. And they also instituted courts in the highest court in China to handle intellectual property rights violation issues. So I think it's important to look at, not just where China is now, but looking at the trajectory China is going towards.
Gong, China has also complained that some of what the United States has been asking for would amount to an infringement on its sovereignty. Does Beijing have a point there?
Yes. We don't have a lot of information about enforcement mechanism. It's being currently negotiated, but at least there are some reports saying that the Chinese government is concerned that these some of the ideas proposed by Ms. Leihaizer could be intrusive and could infringe upon the country's sovereignty. So there must be something going on, but I think that's the bottom line, that it's very difficult to conceive from China's perspective. And also I want to add a note that the idea of keeping some of the tariffs in place could be very difficult for the Chinese government to explain to the people here in China from a political point of view. And I would argue that it's got to be very difficult for the Chinese government to accept that, because the whole negotiation is about restoring the situation before these tariffs are introduced. And now we've gone through all of these, and we're still seeing some tariffs out there in place. So this got to be very, very difficult to explain to the people here in China. And it is something that's very difficult for the government to swallow, in my opinion. So I think this is an issue that probably being heatedly discussed between Mr. Liu He and Mr. Lighthizer.
Jeff, I want to get back to a point you talked about a moment ago on whether this is more of a political deal than a trade deal. There is one view, I've seen it in one place only, which was on CNBC, very influential television channel here in the United States. It reports that traders are very cynical about a deal. They believe President Trump wants to keep the Chinese happy because ultimately what he wants is a nuclear deal with the North Koreans, with the DPRK. Do you see linkage here?
Well, prior to President Trump, we kept separate issues in separate lanes. North Korea was in one lane, trade was in another lane. President Trump decided to link those two issues. So he may have some expectation that China may be able to help. Quite frankly, I think Chinese officials are as frustrated with the North Koreans as the Americans are. China does have leverage, but China will never exercise full leverage because it has a couple very important interests. One, it does not want North Korean refugees coming into China, and two, it does not want American troops or South Korean troops up on the North Korea-Chinese border. So I have always believed that President Trump's hopes were misplaced with regard to North Korea, and that linking those two was an enormous mistake.
Saruhan, the New York Times says that there's an inherent contradiction in the White House trade goal. Trump wants China to buy more from the United States, but most of those purchases are going to be made by Chinese state-owned enterprises. So don't those state-owned enterprises actually hold some leverage over these suppliers in the United States?
They do. Not only that, John, an interesting thing is Asian Development Bank came up with a report recently, actually this week, showing that the greenfield FDI, foreign direct investment from China to the region, went up by 200%. That tells me that the Chinese business is actually diverging, they're reworking their supply chains, and they are taking care of in any kind of problem that the trade tariffs actually could be left there for a longer time. So they're getting ready for that. The US also increased their greenfield investment in the region, but up to 70%. So yes, there's an inherent problem there. It is very difficult to count trade numbers, and you can go around it very effectively, especially picking up countries that the United States does not apply tariffs on, such as Vietnam, such as Malaysia.
Young Liang, more of a philosophical question here. One of the guiding principles for the Chinese in these negotiations over the past year is that any agreement has to be a win-win agreement. Do you see a win-win agreement here?
Well, I think so, for the most part. I think some of the very thorny issues that, President Trump is demanding on China, such as, improving the intellectual property rights protection, ban forced technology transfer, some of these are not in the short-term interest short-term interests of China. But I think going, forward, it is aligned with China's national interest to, enforce intellectual property rights protection and so on and so forth. But one of the things, for example, that President Trump required China to reduce, for example, government support and subsidies in technological innovations, I think this is not necessarily, in the interest of China. Although we do see recently that the Chinese government announced to cut the subsidies on electric car purchases because it was too expensive and it may be counterproductive and disincentivize, better technological innovations and so on and so forth. But I do see that for the most part, the two countries can work together, being the two largest countries in the world, to have this sort of win-win situations. Trade is not a zero-sum game. So I think, it makes no sense for, President Trump to keep, this sort of trade tensions going on in order to, suppress China's development. Yeah.
John Gong, we have seen tensions rising between China and the United States, not just on the trade issue, on other issues as well, strategic issues, geopolitical issues. With a trade agreement, though, could we see those tensions being reduced, or is is there still a whole load of other things that they have to discuss?
I think it's going to help, but it's not going to resolve the issue of competitive nature between the nature of the relationships between the United States and China. Now, even in the trade area, this only addresses. Look, keep in mind that this whole idea, this whole issue here, tension here, originates from this Section 301 report, which is only one of the tools the United States government has with respect to addressing, trade grievances with China. And, I look at the, just look at the number of cases lining up in the anti-dumping cases against China, lining up at the Department of Commerce. A lot of them going on right now. I think the Department of Commerce issues, like 2 or 3 cases each month. So, even in the trade area, I think the tensions are still there. But overall, I hope this is a truth. I think overall, the trade and investment between the United States and China are still good for both countries, even though it appears to me that the United States government is already adopting a decoupling strategy, at least in the technology area. It's increasingly difficult for both countries to cooperate in research and R&D. Just yesterday, I think MIT announces that it's going to sever its ties with ZTE and Huawei. I think definitely is a result of pressure from the United States government. So things of that nature is already happening, and regrettably, this is going to continue this trend.
Saruhan, what's business sentiment like in the United States on this trade dispute? I mean, is Wall Street looking for a quick resolution here?
Well, they have been, and they have been rewarded. If you look at, with the exception of the fourth quarter of last year, anytime that the idea of reducing tension between the two countries came to play, the stock market reacted very positively to it. So yes, U.S. corporations want this. They don't want tariffs. They want to go invest in China. They want to do business in China. But at the same time, Anand, more and more we're hearing from these corporations, head of these corporations, that we haven't heard before, that they're appreciative of the efforts that are taking place, in that they could have market access in China that they didn't think they could today. So it is kind of a give and take situation, but overall, yes, they'll be happy if the trade war ends.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.